Hello, everyone. I would like to give a brief preface to this podcast by saying it was made an effort to open people's eyes to the astronomical pain caused to Kazakh people during the 20th century. My goal for this podcast is to show how such a small detail, like someone's name, can promote a ripple effect on society, specifically how the changing of Kazakh names affected the everyday lives of Kazakhs in the Soviet Union. I encourage everyone listening to do research on their own time and let this interview open your mind to the problem of what to name the children. Okay, can we start by just having you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Zoya Johnson. Was born and raised in Kazakhstan, and at the time that I was born, it was Republic of Kazakhstan, USSR, part of the Soviet Union.
Okay, how old are you?
I am 48.
48. And can you tell me what tribe you came from, what clan?
I came from clan Shaprashte, which is the older. There in Kazakhstan, there are three Kazakh people have three clans, like three brothers, older, middle, and the youngest. So my tribe is the older tribe, part of the older tribe, and it's Shaprashte.
And those are called the hordes, right? Old, middle, young. Zhuz, Kazakh Zhuz, you know.
Yeah, Zhuz is basically a Kazakh name for tribe.
Tell me, we have a tradition in Kazakhstan between naming children by what they came with. Could you tell me a little bit about that and how it works?
Yeah, it's a very old tradition. They would name their children like according to some event that happened to them. Like, for example, my great-grandmother was pregnant with my grandfather, and when the labor came, she was drinking tea, so she named him with tea, which is literally Shai Min, and that was his name. And my other grandfather, or great-great-great-grandfather, was born in a field with a lot of cattle. And so the cattle manure, one of the cows manure, horse manure, I don't know which one, was stuck to him when he was laid on the grass or whatever. And so they named him actually.
Came with manure.
Yeah, came with manure, something like that. It's just normal. It was because that's what their life was like. They didn't really laugh at that. And the third thing, they would name their children after some great warriors. Like my father, his name is Timir, and that's the great Batir, or warrior. He was named after the great warrior.
See, that's such a powerful thing because it's just a giant, unique aspect to being Kazakh, is that we have these people that we give them names and they hold power because of the reputation of the people before them and because of whenever they're born. Mm-hmm. Do you think that has an effect on like Kazakh identity and how people see themselves being named by someone powerful?
Yes, of course. Yes, they named after a warrior. Just, it's what their parents want them to be brave. They want them to conquer. They want them to achieve something, so they name them like that. And actually, like, my grandfather wanted to have three sons, and there were three great warriors, Amir, Temir, and Tulegen. So, well, he ended up just having two of them, two sons like that, named like that. And sometimes it's just, like I said, she didn't have a name. The other grandmother didn't have a name. A great-grandmother, she didn't have a name ready, so she just felt like, I have to name him something. And so she just said, tea. With tea. And it actually sounds really beautiful in Shaimin. And I don't think that it's such a unique name. I don't think that there's another name like that in the whole Kazakhstan.
Okay.
So I think it's like history. So
it is. And this tradition is actually strictly Kazakh. It doesn't pass over into Kyrgyzstan. Most Kyrgyz people don't even know about it, actually. I discovered that in an oral history class at a certain point. And that was very surprising, how specifically Kazakh this is. And there's a lot of Central Asia that mingles with each other. We have a lot of the same dishes, just named a little bit different. We're pretty much just all brothers and sisters, to put it simply. And so to have something that's uniquely a part of our culture is very special. Do you think you'd agree with that statement?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Wholeheartedly.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about what you remember from stories about Soviets coming in?
I just remember growing up, the Soviet Union was already pretty much established. And I had a Russian grandmother, and the whole society made me understand and feel like that part of me, I should nurture the fact that I am quarter Russian. And first of all, I was given a Russian name, and it gave me some sort of a privilege in society, like to be related, to have a Russian grandmother, gave you a privilege, a sort of a step forward.
Now, at a certain point, you went to Russia when you were younger. Can you tell me a little bit about how they treated you because you were Kazakh?
Yes, I went. I actually went twice with my grandmother to a village near Moscow, and so that's where her family was. I did not face rejection from the actual family. They were okay with me, I guess. But like if I went out in the street, so I was only 9, 10 years old, but there were children playing at the playground near courtyards and stuff like that. And when they saw me, they would actually like put their hands on their eyes and stretch them out, and just like, and also stick their tongues out and just like, and call me Chukcha, which is like a northern nation that everybody thinks that they have the narrowest eyes and they're the most behind people, so they would just point fingers and say Chukcha, so which made me feel really humiliated and small.
So in that moment, you can proudly, or you can say outright that you didn't feel proud to be Kazakh.
No, I was ashamed. It made me ashamed of being there. I felt like I needed to get out of there. I felt like I needed to just get back home. This is not the place where I'm comfortable, where I want to be. But my grandmother looked totally at home. She felt at home. She loved it there. So I was forced to kind of adjust to this situation. But the older women kind of befriended me and felt sorry for me.
So in Kazakhstan at this time, it's fair to say you had some sort of an advantage by A, being from a military family, and B, having a part of a Russian identity via your name, because Babushka named you, your mother named you Zoya, which is a traditional Russian name, and that gave you an advantage in Kazakhstan. But then once you went to it, as if, you can identify with them, which must have made you feel a little more relaxed, a little more, okay, I can get by here a little better. But then whenever you went to Russia, they said, no, you're not. Which, do you think that had an effect on your identity?
Yeah, I felt betrayed. It's like, and I felt like, well, I don't belong here, although I have a Russian name and a Russian grandmother, don't belong here. But when I was in Kazakhstan, my grandparents, my grandfather was Kazakh, but he adjusted. He was basically accumulated a whole Russian culture, and a lot of people called him a Russian name. His family, his wife's family, gave him a name, Sasha Alexander, and so because they couldn't pronounce his name, or they just didn't want to say it, so he actually adapted to that, and he would speak Russian inside a house, and they created some sort of a good, very warm climate for me. Although he did try to teach me a few Kazakh phrases, he never forgot his language, and he called me a really nice pet name, which was a Kazakh name, which kind of reminded me that I'm not really Russian. So, and then when I went to see my father's family, which was purely Kazakh, I felt really out of place because all of them had Kazakh names. They knew how to eat Kazakh dishes. They knew how to converse in Kazakh. And so, although I looked like them, I looked fully like them, I never really could fully connect with them because of my name and because of me raised like a Russian.
And okay, so just to be clear, the grandfather you're referring to would be Shaimian, which is your maternal grandfather.
Yeah, he was fully adjusted and kind of Russified. They call them Russified Kazakhs or Soviets, where he just completely adjusted and he didn't have a problem being Russified or being Russian or being Soviet. So yes, I had a Russified family on my mother's side, which is Russian and Kazakh mixed, and then I have a purely Kazakh family on my father's side. We're very traditional and culturally only like more traditional Kazakh family.
Okay, so Russified in this situation would mean, well, it means specifically to have sort of changed your identity into, adapted your identity for the USSR at that time.
Yes.
So we have a clear depiction here of how the environment affected someone who had a little bit of Russian blood, which is you can identify with being a little bit Russian in Kazakhstan, and you're treated a little bit better by society, but bad by the parts of society who have a correct image on Russians, which is that they colonized us completely and killed millions. A third of the population in Kazakhstan alone died. I believe half of the population in Kyrgyzstan died, that was a little bit earlier in the night right before World War I. And of course, setting all that aside for a moment, we have as we can sort of see here how having a Russian name affects a little bit how you're treated. Because you're going to be automatically treated a little bit better because society was very controlled by Russians. Everything was controlled by Russians during that time. And so, in that sense, you're treated better. Although, can you tell me about what, out of your particular perspective for a moment, what was the general, that you can pinpoint, what was the general picture of Kazakhs from Russians? How did they see Kazakh people? For example, my experience with that would be from meeting Russians. I've seen a lot of them seeing us, they're just basically Chinese. Some of them will just generalize us completely. A lot of them call, actually there's a name for all of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and most of Central Asia is referred to as Kyrgyzia, which is a very offensive term. And it was made by Russians, as far as I understand, to just generalize everyone there and a whole giant chunk of history. And we can see through that how they tried to sort of erase everything whenever they colonized us. And there was also a giant ethnic cleansing. And all of that being said, you kind of come to a conclusion, and I think that in general it's fair to say that a lot of Kazakh people came to the conclusion that either they were going to fight to keep their Kazakh identity, or they were going to adapt and lose a part of who they were. Because in this sense, in this part of the world, culture is giant. It's huge. It affects everything. Nationalism is a great motivation to Central Asian people. There are so many jokes about it, songs, even slight differences in language affected the development of affected the societal development. And so the changing of names is a great example of a very small event that had a ripple throughout Kazakh culture. Now, let's go back to your family for a second. Do you think that you could describe a little bit to me of what Shaimian, your maternal grandfather, went through whenever the Russians came in, and how he ended up changing his name to Sasha?
I don't know much about that because he was basically a baby in this family that was very poor, and their cattle, their money, everything was taken away from them. And so he was the baby, and he was put in the orphanage. So from the very young age, his mother couldn't raise him, so she put him in the orphanage. So he pretty much raised from the ground up. He raised to completely ignore what he came from. And he was a fully Soviet man, which means that they said your nationality doesn't matter. All that matter is the Soviet party. And so he spoke very little Kazakh language. He spoke mostly Russian. He was educated in Russian universities, Soviet universities at the time. So, and he spent most of his life fighting in the World War II and living on Russian territory, like Ukraine at that time, also Ukraine, Russia. So basically, he did not go back to his country, native country, until he was in his 50s, late 50s.
He was visibly Asian, correct?
Yes.
Very, by the photos of him, you can just, it's right at most, he has a very, very ethnic face, very clearly Kazakh. You can't mistake it at all.
Yes.
Do you think that affected how he went through, maybe in Ukraine? Do you think that, or your mother, she was raised in Ukraine as well, and she's also visibly, like, very clearly Asian. Do you think that maybe that affected how she viewed herself, being primarily raised around white people? Or do you think that she herself thought she was white and had a weird perspective of herself, being only surrounded by Ukrainians and other Russians?
Yes, she identified her and her sister both in their passports, in spite of the fact that by the law you're supposed to put the nationality of your father as your nationality. She chose to put her mother's nationality as her nationality, and she just basically completely denied her nationality, and she did not look at herself as a Kazakh. She didn't identify herself as that until maybe early 90s, whenever it's already the fall of the Soviet Union. And she maybe had like 3 to 4 Russian friends versus maybe 1 Kazakh friend. She didn't trust Kazakh people. She didn't speak their language. So she was totally, like, you can call her, she was fully Russian, and that's how she was raised. And her father did not have any problem with it. So he never spoke up to me about it. He only told me war stories. So I didn't know how he felt about it, but you could see it in his daughters.
That's clear, very clear. And so going back to the family history here, so Shai Mian was raised in a, you could say, relatively farmer house, wealthy before the Soviets came in. Whenever they took everything, he was put into an orphanage. And at what age was that? Do you recall? Was 10? Maybe?
He hardly knew his mother, so I would say before 10.
But she was alive.
She was alive. So they came and probably visited him. So, but probably before school age. I'm thinking preschool age.
That's interesting, and that was a pretty common practice back then.
Yes.
Correct. Whenever they came
because
in,
they couldn't raise them. They couldn't
afford them.
Yes.
Now. Do you think that had he somehow been able to be raised in that family, you would have a different, had he been able to be raised in that family and then let's say he took the same path, do you think that would have affected Babushka or your mother and how she saw herself?
Of course. I mean, that probably, I don't know. The war is what affected everything. But probably, yes. If she was raised in Kazakhstan, she would have probably embraced her culture more, and she would probably feel more of, or at least she would get to know her culture more than the way she was raised.
And when you were younger, were you aware of the death toll in Kazakhstan by Russians? Was it portrayed at all in the media, from what you recall?
No, not at all. We completely skipped it. Our history books never taught us anything, and so by the time in the early 90s, whenever finally the Soviet Empire had collapsed, that's when we started learning stuff about it. So we started learning what collectivization really did to us. We started learning that there are Kazakhs that ran away to China and Germany and Sweden and stuff like that. So we learned that there was a lot of we had actually a lot of losses. And my grandmother, my other grandmother, my father's mother, told me that her parents were actually, she was also got put in orphanage, and her parents were actually taken away from her. And she said that somebody whispered in her ear when she was like 8 years old that her parents was used as human organ donors, where they just were taken away and she never seen them again. And she said that they may have just started using them as human organ donors, which is very, very cruel. And she never seen her father, and so.
No, that's a heavy thing to hear, and it's definitely something that was hidden from the majority of the Kazakh public. And right now, if you
she
go
always
to
told me that when no one's in the room.
Yes.
She always told me that in whispers.
If you go to Kazakhstan right now, you'll find it's getting a little bit better as of the past 10 years, but you'll find a bunch of Kazakh people who refuse to, who will sort of defend Soviets because of a lot of the brainwashing that happened during that time. Now, referring back to the name project, your name is Zoya, and your Kazakh family called you by your maternal grandfather Shaiman. He referred to you as I understand, Ainaline. What does that mean?
It means the sweetheart, we call her. Just a very, very, what do you call it? Pet name, very nice name.
Do you
it actually means I walk around you. That's part of the name. It means I walk around you. So that means I guess I
around you.
Adore you or something like that.
Yeah, and do you remember positive memories being referred to as that name as opposed to being referred to as Zoya?
The only time that I felt good is whenever he called me that. So I only felt like that when he was around. So he created this little microclimate of a something sacred, something that's broken, but it was kept like a little tiny music box that you open and start playing. Mm-hmm. So because when I was with him, he would start speaking Kazakh, and he would always tell me one phrase, will you come back tomorrow? And he would always say that phrase in Kazakh. He never said that in Russian because he wanted me to learn that phrase, just one of those phrases. So it was very special for me, and I felt like he, being raised in Russian culture and being adapted fully to it, he still kept part of that and kind of communicated it back to me as something special, as something dear, as something precious. And so it's kind of like a little plant that you plant. So it was planted in me.
That was directly contradicting what the Russians would tell you, what the Russians taught.
Yes.
Directly contradicting it. And it was a very personal thing that he referred to you as Ainaline.
Yes.
And now...
and he would always say, like phrases like hello. He would say it in Kazakh, and he would say like thank you in Kazakh, so that he'll just put a little bit of this influence in me, just kind of, and it made it not forced. It made it very precious and loving.
Can you say something in Kazakh that maybe he used to say to you?
Yeah, he said, "Yerten kelesin?" So that means, are you coming tomorrow, or something like, Rahmet. That's what he would say when I would put his slippers in front of him. He would always say Rahmet.
I would just like to get a little bit of a sense of the language around it. And thank you, that really helps. Now, going back to your paternal side, as far as I know, so your clan is Shaprashti, and that is, as I understand it, a politician clan.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's a ruling clan, for the most part, yeah.
And we had a president, Nazarbayev was Shaprashti, no?
Yes.
And, of course, Nazarbayev was a horrendous president who was put in by the Soviets, which is very dangerous to say, especially online, but I'll say it. Setting that aside, the Shaprashti, were they kind to you when they found out you had Russian blood?
Not really. I always felt like an outsider. Like I would try to hide that fact. I would try to not say it. But the only way that they would find out about it is that my lack of knowledge, of Kazakh knowledge, because they would always test me. The other side of the family, they would start talking to me in Kazakh because they all were fluent, and I couldn't say anything back to him, and so that's what would make them kind of despise me and my raising. So I was not close to them.
Now, do you think, I'm going to run through a scenario here. Let's pick a random Kazakh name, Ayjan. So it means, as I understand it, moonlight, something like that.
Yeah.
Do you think that had you been named that, and had maybe Babushka been more welcoming of Kazakh culture, if you were named Ayjan, and maybe if they were spoken Kazakh to more, that you would have been able to relate to your Kazakh family on your paternal side?
Yes, of course I would.
They had a name for you, right? A Kazakh
yes,
name.
My grandmother, in order to calm her husband, who was very violently
Racist.
disagreeing. What?
He hated the Russians.
Yeah, he didn't like them. Yes, and he disagreed with the fact that my father married a half Russian person, and so she, in attempt to make peace with everyone, she would call me by a different name. She would say Zaure, "Hi Zaure," and I would not answer her because, and that would be just very weird, because to me, why is she calling me that? And
you were quite young then.
Yes, I was like 3 years old.
I bet you didn't understand what was going on.
Mm-mm.
Now, reverting back a little bit.
But I understand that she did that to help me.
Yes.
She tried to
make
me
you
feel
at
accepted.
home.
Yes.
And now reverting back a little bit. So what we have here is a clear pattern. We have in Kazakhstan, in your school, by society, since you had a little bit of Russian blood and since you were named Zoya, to the general public you were given an advantage. Then in Russia, because you're Asian and because you're Kazakh, it didn't matter that your name was Russian, it didn't matter that your blood had a little bit of Russian blood in there, because you looked Kazakh, and because they don't like Kazakhs, they think of them. I believe the phrase used was to stomp on Kazakhs like cockroaches. They put out propaganda and told Russian people to kill as many as they wanted, use them like cockroaches. That was in the 30s, as I remember. Now, don't paraphrase me on that. That one's taken from a news article, and I would like to cite it. If I can, I can't. So, take it with a grain of salt. Setting that aside, you go to Russia, you're too Kazakh. In the general society, you're always going to be too Kazakh, but anything Russian that you can hold on to is good. And in your family, on your paternal side, you're too Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the giant conflict that formed, and contradiction in a country. And this is a pattern that you'll find in what I would imagine you can find it in any colonized country. You have how controlled the media is, or in this case, lack thereof.
Well, you can see that happening on all levels. Like, let's say there's a city called Akmala. That city was called Akmala. Then they renamed it as Tselenograd, mm-hmm. which were And
the first name is a Kazakh name, the second is a Russian name.
Yes, and it was named that because the Russians used it as a planting ground for the wheat project of Khrushchev. So they named it Tselenograd. And so there's like a lot of cities and train stations in Kazakhstan where all the names were Russian. And this is what's happening right now. Kazakhs are taking back their train stations, their cities, and they're renaming them by their original names, or they're coming back with new names for them that are Kazakh. And it's actually, go ahead. As
you put it, they're renaming the cities, right? What reaction did Russians have to that?
Ooh, they don't like that, and this actually was a great argument with two Russian journalists, one Kazakh and Russian. A Russian journalist was attacking the Kazakh journalists for what the Kazakhs are doing. Well, why is Russians angry? Why are other Russians angry? Because they consider Kazakhstan as part of their territory, just like Ukraine.
And ultimately, I believe there were threats made about them coming in and once again invading Kazakhstan and taking everything that Kazakhs have worked to accomplish. Mm-hmm. Economically speaking, Kazakhstan has grown into a Central Asian power. I mean, a great power. We have had great prosperity economically. Of course, that wasn't mirrored in our identity because of the placement of Nazarbayev in power. I believe he was in power for 30 years, and he was an intense megalomaniac. Saying that aside, that the renaming, now we have a lot of villages that were, as you put, changed to Russian names, and there were even camps that were devoted entirely to re-educating Kyrgyz, Kazakh, and Uzbek children. Many of my friends and a lot of people that you will meet were sent to those camps, and these camps would teach people like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. They would teach them all of these things as their history. The only problem with this, and the biggest problem with this, is that they had Russian names. They were not Kazakh, they were not Kyrgyz, and yet these people, I think the point that we're trying to make here is that something as small as changing names and taking away language and effect has this giant ripple effect on how the identity forms in a young Kazakh child and how much of a tool names are. And now, thinking about that, do you think that it would benefit Kazakh culture if something was to be put out and we were to start naming our people once again as we named them before, either after great warriors or with what they came with?
Yeah, and I think it's already happening. It's already happening. It's a whole generation that is your generation that is
Gen Z, that is.
Do not have a single European name. And now their culture has in the process of restoring back to them, where almost all of generation Z actually speaks their own language. And I think that once that generation starts having children, I think they will be free to name them however they want, because they already have the strong identity inside them, so they don't have to do anything to to restore it. It's already there. They're more they feel Kazakh already, and so they don't have to prove it to anyone.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. That's a really great step in the right direction. Of course, that is actively being fought by Russian people. Russian people are, even Russian refugees that have come in, have been completely ungrateful to Kazakh people for taking them in. They have been there have been many hate crimes. And then going back, there was a revolution in, 2021, I believe, or 2022, in which Russian soldiers were sent in. And once again, many Kazakhs had to pay the price for just brutality. And it's a really traumatizing thing to put a culture through. And in many ways, this whole situation of the millions of Kazakhs that have died has been easily and also difficultly compared to the colonization of even America, and the way the sheer just disregard for any life. They were thought of as literal cockroaches or rats that needed to be just killed and taken away or re-educated, and that was the only way they were valuable. This is mirrored in many colonization stories from Europeans, and the way that it works seems to follow the same pattern. And this is the last point we're going to talk about here today, and that would be my name. My given name was Leah, and I believe my name was named this because it was the same in every language, and so I could get by in Kazakhstan and in America, and that followed a very interesting pattern. My being biracial and named Leah, it was a diverse way of helping me get by, and my name became a tool to which I could get through life a little bit easier than my siblings.
I guess I followed my tradition.
Yes,
I followed the tradition of my family.
You followed the Russian, the what to name the children. The article talks about it a lot. Now,
although I thought that Leah also represented to me an example of a strong woman.
Now,
a Bible name, yes.
Recently, I took to choosing a Central Asian name as to for a part of me to reclaim a lot of what I feel like I didn't experience, coming from a very strongly whitewashed family. You immigrated to America, and you no longer, because my father sort of set the expectation that we would be living in America, and that was our goal. We were taught to speak, at least me and my younger siblings were taught as well to speak English only. And there was just this giant culture of we're not going to really acknowledge that we're Kazakh people, or in my case that we're half Kazakh. We're going to acknowledge primarily the American side, and that was how I was raised. And for a while, I didn't even understand why my brother, he looked very Asian, and I didn't quite get what any of that meant. And so recently I took to renaming myself, or choosing a Central Asian name that I can go by, because it makes me feel a little bit more in connection. And do you think how do you think that can help me? Do you think that choosing a Central Asian name was a good decision, and going by it for a little while until it makes me more comfortable with my identity could help?
Looking back now, I think that, I was always made to feel like if I had a Kazakh name, that would make me, growing up, feel ugly, unattractive. And I was taught that Kazakhs' names are ugly because they did not end in A.
Yeah, so I'm going to pause you briefly there and say that in Russian culture, most names are ending in a vowel, and that's a linguistic aspect, because most feminine nouns end in vowels as well.
Particularly A vowel.
Exactly. So you'll see that in patterns: Anastasia, Olga, Natasha,
Marina,
Nastya. All of these names. Tanya, yeah. All of these names, Sonia, Svetlana. Now we're just coming up with them. All of these names end in A for the specific reason. It's also the last name. Last names of Russian people end in A. So if your father's name was Tezekbayev, and your name was Tezekbayeva, so if you're a girl, your last name ends in A. Now this is not the truth in Kazakhstan at all.
No.
Our names end in consonants, and that's just fine.
No, actually, my name would have been Tezekbay. No, my name would be Tezekbay Kızı, which means a girl of Tezekbay.
Yes.
Or if you were a boy, your name would have been Tezekbay Ulu, which means a son of Tezekbay. So actually, that sounds even better. But
yeah, I remember there was a famous joke at my university, because I was so proud to be Kazakh. Everyone called me, "Hey, Kazakh kızı," which means Kazakh, like Kazakh girl, which was kind of, it was a joke because I had dyed my hair blonde and pretty much hid most if not all of my Kazakh features, as to kind of find some sort of identity, which now and to this day I still find a lot of shame in my decision to do that, but I still do it because ultimately the more Kazakh I look, it is unfortunate by the Eurocentric beauty standards, the less attractive I am considered. Although myself, I've thought Kazakh women are some of the most beautiful women in the world. In my opinion, Kazakh features are gorgeous, yet still somehow there's always an urge to look more European. You see this imitated in the makeup. The way that we do our makeup is very obviously. We have eye surgeries, extremely common. And you were encouraged to get plastic surgery as well to get rid of
my
your...
mother, yes.
Yes, your mother told you...
Make your eyes bigger.
Make your eyes bigger, more round. My mother, you can't see her, but she has a little bit of a nose bridge, which is a little less common for Kazakh people. Usually they have very small noses, and that in itself gave you an advantage as well. As I believe it, Babushka said, your nose is just fine.
Fair skin.
Fair skin, yeah. Those things that were just slightly Russian automatically made you more noticeable.
But also, like I said, there was my mother had a best friend, Russian friend. Her name was Olga, and she was mentioning, there were, as usually women do, they will judge people, gossip about different women, and they were talking about one particular woman who was a Kazakh nationality and who was extremely beautiful. But my mother's best friend Olga said, "Oh, she's pretty for a Kazakh."
And she's Russian.
So yeah, Olga, yeah.
Yes.
She's pretty for a Kazakh. And I remember that my mother actually surprisingly took issue with that. I don't know why she would do that, because she considered herself to be Russian. So it technically did not even apply to her, but she actually took an issue with that, and she reprimanded her friends like, "What is that? What does that mean?"
Yes.
So yeah.
To paint a clear picture, as we wrap this up, I would like to go ahead and say that all of my Kazakh family, besides like our cousins Kostya, Dennis, they all look pretty much, you couldn't mistake them. They're visibly Asian. Even my grandmother, your mother, she's very Asian, very visibly Asian. You can't mistake it.
More than me.
Yes, you really can't mistake it. She doesn't look part Russian at all, and yet still the Russian, the brainwashing has been so heavy that even though she looks in the mirror and she sees Asian features, visibly Kazakh features, she will never be able to come to terms with the fact that she is Kazakh.
I want to say this one thing. There's hope in that because, like I said, this new generation, people that are fighting the Russian influence, are creating a very different atmosphere, a new country, and in which my mother is actually finally, is proudly, and when I heard her, I was very surprised. She actually changed her nationality in her passport as a Kazakh. She basically, and she's trying to speak it. She's actually learning.
Wow.
She understands.
I stand corrected.
Yeah, she begins to learn it. So even being 73 or 73, yeah, 74 this year, she is finally embracing her culture.
Yes, and this in big has part to do with how Kazakhs are finally realizing, hey, we were colonized. A big part of that, you were thought to be saved. They thought Soviets brought civilization and how amazing it was. Of course, we never know what would have happened had the pastoral nomadic people stayed pastoral nomadic. They could have come to great realizations that could have made that our culture could have developed into something even better than what it is today. Although today it's quite beautiful and special, and you won't see anything like it all over the world, which is true of any culture. I mean, they're so vibrant, and it's amazing that they've managed to keep this after the massacre of genocide and the famine that was the intentional famine that went across Kazakhstan. Now, finally, I would like to ask you to maybe imagine that a young Kazakh person is here, and maybe they're feeling a little bit not ashamed to be Kazakh. What is something that you can tell them that maybe you think would encourage them to be proud and to choose a traditional name for their child?
I would say dive into history. Dive into your own history. Find the books. Find anything that you can find to read about your culture and see how peculiar it is. And more you read and more you educate yourself, the prouder you will get.
That's a wonderful point you made.
At this point, in closing, I would like to thank my mother for having the courage to sit and discuss something that I know was extremely difficult for her. I would also like to point out that the media has been nearly silent on this subject for decades. This, among other reasons, is largely due to the bodies of journalists who were honest being washed up on the shores of Balkhash, a large lake in eastern Kazakhstan. This issue not only affected my mother, but her parents, neighbors, friends, and community. There is no Kazakh in Kazakhstan who knows not the effect of Soviet atrocities. The lives of all of these people is why it is so important to regain any and all senses of identity, starting with what to name our children.